I was very encouraged recently looking at our family tree of churches that have been planted in the Great Commission Heartland region, all of them out of one church in the Kansas City area, and now have resulted in 20 church plants. And when you look at that, you really think, boy, something good's going on. God's been up to something. And I was reminded of a quote by Carl George who said, when you are really onto something, it will lead to more and more profound questions. And some of the questions I've been asking are, what movement DNA is needed to sustain movement? What movement killers might result in stumps in the family tree? What movement DNA will result in more exponential movement? These are defining realities. Like Max Dupree once said, the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. And we as key leaders in our churches, in movements, in our networks, I love that metaphor of key leader. A key is something that opens a door or shuts a door. And in this pivotal time in history, with all kinds of change going on, with technology and societal changes, cultural changes, key leadership is essential to be definitive, to be exemplary to our churches and our movements and our networks. Now, the ultimate reality is with Jesus, of course, and that's why we need to refound movement realities. Look for some of those silver bullets in our defining documents, the New Testament in particular. And when you look at movements in our lifetime, it's interesting to think through the ones that I've been a part of. I came to Christ at a time when the church renewal movement was still happening, and one of the evangelical voices at that time was Robert Coleman, who wrote the Master Plan of Evangelism, which had an impact into the next movement, the church growth movement. And then more recently, we had the emergent church movement. What about today? What about movement today? The word missional is thrown around quite a bit. I think to define missional or Great Commission movement, we need to revisit the Master's plan, don't we? The Master. And that's where the ultimate reality lies, because there is no plan B. His plan for us is the one we need to carry out. Now again, we key leaders define reality. How we see our churches, how we see our people, will reignite movement potentials in them. Let's refound those flashpoints for Movement Firestorm. Find those silver bullets, if you will, for movement realities from the New Testament. Let's reignite. That's the topic I recently taught on, and I'd love for you to watch the rest of this video and give me your feedback, especially if you're a practitioner, a working theologian. Those are the people I'd love to hear from especially. So take a look at this and give me your best movement thinking.
It was so fun connecting with Clint. And I did tell him, he was actually my first pastor. When I came to Christ, I was a student at Rockhurst University. I'll mention that here in just a minute. And I connected up with a bunch of radical people at a church called Cornerstone at UMKC at the time. They've since moved over on the Kansas side as a community church. And it was fun to reminisce with Clint. I told him, I'll never forgive you for sending me out on that church plant, my first one, the way you did. It was a parachute drop. I was a fairly new Christian, a couple of years old in the Lord, and they were saying, we've got this campus, George Mason University over in Washington, D.C. Well, I didn't know better, so I said, okay, I'll go. And so I was telling Clint, I'll never forgive you for doing that to me. And he says, well, I saw something in you that I didn't like. And so, yeah, so he was just getting rid of me. No, of course, he didn't like me to tell the story that way, but that is what he said. Tonight, we are going to be talking about sending, missio, being sent people. Wonderful segue. Thank you for that, Clint. This is going to be one of those talks, different than you're used to. I've got some visuals because we're taping it for some leadership uses, and it's going to be one of those types of messages, kind of a leadership level. But you guys are there. You're with me, right? I know actually we've got all kinds. We've got ones far from God here, ones still seeking God, others that have become believers newly, others that are just followers of Christ to all get out. and others of you are really at a leadership level. And I'm going to be speaking primarily to those who have been Christ followers for a little while, but this message is for all of us. I just want you to know that. There'll be something for all of us. In circles these days, the past couple of years, there's been a lot of talk of, do we need a new Reformation? Because the 500-year anniversary of the Reformation is coming up in 2017. And so this conversation will only intensify. And if I were to answer that question, I would say it depends really on my audience. You know, if I'm talking to a Catholic audience, and that's my background, I actually attended Rockhurst University when I came to Christ, although one of the theology classes I took there caused me to doubt that God even existed. So based on that, I'd say, yeah, I think we need some reformation, some new reformation. But Pope Francis just recently, at the turn of the year, gathered some of the cardinals there in the Roman Curia and said that he wants to reform the disease of leadership. So he's even seeing the need for reform. So in some ways, we always want to be reforming, right? I mean, that's part of our walk as believers, becoming more like Christ, even personally. But at a level of, say, Protestantism or even evangelicals, that's primarily who I'll be speaking to, us as an audience. We're an evangelical audience. We have some challenges in our day, and this is one of them. This has become kind of the new face for evangelicalism. That's a little bit scary, though, to me. It's the largest Protestant church in America. They really teach a health, wealth, and prosperity gospel, false teaching. And I bring this up because Joel Osteen recently was in the news for wanting to rebuke Paul, Peter, and John, of all people, saying that they were wrong, they're outdated on some issues, and that we just need to correct that. Well, that's quite the opposite of what I've got in mind. I would say, really, to an evangelical audience, we don't necessarily need to go back to formational levels as a new Reformation. We need to go back to a refounding. We need to go back to Paul and Peter and John, our founders. Absolutely. And even further back, Jesus, the one founder. We'll be talking a lot about that. So what I want to talk about tonight is a refounding, finding some of those flashpoints that'll really fan into flame a firestorm. I want to talk about movement DNA. And that's language some of you aren't used to. Some of us at our Campfire Discipleship have been talking about these things. What does it mean to be a movement? What is a movement? What is a movement kind of church? And we're going to rediscover some things, and I think you'll find them energizing. I sure have, as I've done some research this past year or so on this topic. We were at one of the Sending Network gatherings, and one of the speakers just a month and a half ago threw this up on the screen. 1.5 million. Asked everybody, what do they think that represents? And of course, there was dialogue, things thrown out. I have the answer right here. That's the cost per baptism in the U.S. $1.5 million. Can you believe it? With all that we do with buildings and training pastors, it all nets us that much money, one baptism. Ken Forbes reached over to me and said, I'll do it for half that. I thought that was good. Over 80% of churches in the North America are in some form of decline. They're either declining or plateaued. And most of those that are growing, the wide majority, are growing from switchers or transfer growth. That's just a fact because the conversion growth is really, statistically, researchers are saying about 1 to 3%. That's problematic, isn't it? Here's some of the latest research for American churches. That's going to be my focus tonight. 84% is a pretty accurate number for those that are in decline or plateaued. That's this green part here. Most churches are in some form of decline. 14% are growing, but as we mentioned, it's primarily by addition, switching, or transferring from some of these in the 84%. About 2 to 4%, they'll be publishing some of this pretty soon. This is unpublished information, but they're looking at about 2 to 4% of churches that are actually replicating by either adding a site or planting a church. And I use replicating a little bit loosely there because that includes the multi-sites that, it might be an auditorium that's filling up, so they say, okay, let's add a video venue, those kind of things. When you get down to the churches that are multiplying, that are truly replicating by raising up a leader, resourcing a team, launching them out, and that team has the DNA then to launch another church. It doesn't even show up on the pie chart. There aren't enough of them, especially ones that you look at that are about 4 generations out, 3 and 4 generations of a church that's planted a church that's planted a church that's planted a church. And to add to the confusion, the situation is that most of the churches that exist appeal to, in any community across the United States, about 40% of the community. So, in other words, like Open Range here in Lone Jack, you can figure what we're doing here, that's more of an attractional kind of a thing, come and worship, will only appeal to about 40% of the community. Now, that's true across the United States. And about 95% of the churches are reaching out into that segment. And only about 5% here are thinking missionally about what do we do about these folks that on your best Sunday aren't going to show up at church. And don't get me wrong, I'm a both and kind of guy. It's all about come. Jesus said, come, all you are here weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Come is part of it. Come and see. But then we also say, go and reach. That's part of Jesus' commission, to go to the ones that aren't going to come to us. And that's one of our challenges. And what we're finding is that it's going to take some paradigm shifts, and it's going to take some churches that are innovative to say, hey, I'll be a platform to experiment on what it takes to fulfill the Great Commission in some of these other areas that a church service is not going to reach. And this is sort of a metaphor we could use right here. If you button up the wrong button as you're getting dressed, what happens? At the end, you're kind of cattywampus, right? Now, these buttons, let's say they represent core values or key theology points for a church. And just one out of place kind of looks funny already. Can you imagine getting 1, 2, or 3 core values or points of theology out? You're just downright silly looking at that point, right? So what do we need to do when this happens? When you're all unaligned, what do you got to do? You got to start over, right? You got to unbutton. You got to find the button that starts at the top, and then everything lines up from there. And I want to start tonight with that first button. What do you think it is? We've already alluded to it. We've sang about it. We're going to come back to Jesus is what's central. But what we're going to have to do to reach into this 60% in particular is we're going to have to unlearn some things in order to understand. When you've been doing church a certain way all your life, and it's true of pastors too, you've really got to open yourself up to some paradigm shifts to get anywhere. And I was recently reflecting on Acts 1:8. You shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, Samaria, and even to the ends of the age. Now, it's interesting what happened in 8 chapters when you get to Acts 8:1. Now, of course, we know the excitement that happened at Pentecost, thousands getting saved, and a lot of excitement happening in the early stages. But Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth were just not being reached. And about chapter 8, persecution comes along and forces the church then to spread out into Judea and Samaria and into other parts of the earth. And a question I've been asking myself the past couple days, hey, which one do I want to be a part of? Do I want to do the Acts 1:8 thing and take it to those regions? Or are we going to get persecution to force us out? Anybody want to start with the first one? I'm in on that one. How about you? Let's see what it's going to take to get us to that place. And we may need to unlearn some things as we go here and deal with some paradigm shifts. This is going to be the first button, remastering Jesus as central, the centrality of Jesus. This is an interesting passage here from John 14. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied. And Jesus replied, I have been with you all this time, Philip, and yet you still do not know who I am. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Now stop right there. You can kind of envision Jesus maybe not being so nice in his tone, like I just read it. You kind of get the impression he's a little perturbed. Hey, Philip, how long have we been together? It's been a couple years now. And you're asking this question. And then he answers, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. You get it, dude? So why are you asking me to show him to you? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I speak are not my own, but my Father who lives in me does his work through me. This is key. So we see that Jesus is a representation of the Father. If we want to know about God, we just got to look at Jesus, right? And in Jesus is all of God, and in God the Father is all Christ's likeness. They're one and the same. And so I think we can learn some things by looking at Jesus. And many of us, we get used to going to the epistles and learning from the apostles on how to do church. And there's a lot there about it. But I think the modeling of Jesus has a lot for us to know too. And that's really the foundational place to go. Because if you take Christ out of Christianity, what do you got? You got religiosity, you got religion. And that's what we're getting a lot of. Many of the denominations that started off great. Oh, lately I've been enjoying reading about the Methodist movement and how fiery they spread. And they had the circuit riders. And they went from town to town. And it's interesting. They grew to about, there was a time in the early stages, maybe 2-3% of the population of America were Methodist. But when at the time of the circuit riders, they had grown up to about 30% of the population. Boy, they were spreading out all over. Talk about a movement. Well, some of the other denominations got to pointing fingers at them and saying, hey, your circuit riders don't have enough education. You need some seminary level stuff. And so they decided they were going to send their circuit riders to 3 years of seminary type training. And you can mark the downward slope of that movement from that point. Because the education somehow was pushing out Christ and just the fieriness that they had. And Jesus was quite harsh with the religious leaders, wasn't he? He was tremendously harsh to them, like the Pharisees. It's interesting to consider the Pharisees. If I were to do an altar call and say, tonight, I'd like all of those that want to be a Pharisee, every head bowed, and come forward. Anybody going to come? Probably not. But when you read about the Pharisees, they didn't have it all bad going on. They had some good things that we could cheer about, especially compared to the Sadducees, which were in their day more the liberal bunch. They defended the scriptures. They believed in all of the Old Testament. The Sadducees primarily focused on the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and then they even picked that apart. They believed in the resurrection of the body. Critical. Sadducees did not. That's why they're called sad, you see. Pious. They were very pious and devout, the Pharisees. Very pious. They'd put us to shame in their prayer lives. Passionate. Tremendously passionate. Think of the Apostle Paul before he came to Christ. Very passionate. Tithers. They were very generous, giving. They followed the law in those things. So when you think about who they might represent in our day, let's say the Sadducees are kind of the liberal denominations of their day. Who would the Pharisees be? That'd be us, wouldn't it? I look at that list and I think that's a pretty good one. I kind of see my wife Terry there. She loves the scriptures. She believes in the resurrection. She's very devout, very giving, passionate about the Lord. Those are all good things. But yet they hated Jesus. They despised him, and he was quite harsh with them. And they were the ones that ended up being the most responsible, you could say, for crucifying Christ. Of course, there were others involved, Romans, etc. But the Pharisees were pushing that. Yet Jesus, we can let ourselves off the hook here a little bit. He affirmed these things in his teachings. And so he's kind of theologically in the evangelical camp. So that's a relief, isn't it? Yet they hated his guts. Now, what does Jesus' list look like? If we were to make a list, certainly would include those things. But you also had some things that weren't something you'd see with the Pharisees. Prostitutes and hookers, they just love to flock around Jesus. The drunks, the gluttons, the tax gatherers and the sinners. Boy, he partied with the sinners. Now, of course, he never got drunk. He was sinless. He was the representation of all holiness, was modeled through Jesus like no other. But yet, the religious leaders hated him and they despised him. And we got to ask ourselves, are we willing to be like Christ in a way where we would be? They actually called Jesus a drunkard and a glutton because he hung out with them. I think maybe it's okay if we have hookers in our lives for the right reasons, right? There ought to be some of that going on if we're going to be like Christ. And we're going to reach into that 60% that aren't going to come to a church service. Are you tracking with me? So we've got to learn from Jesus. Now, I'm not saying be Jesus, of course not. If you think you're Jesus, take your pills. But becoming like Jesus, certainly. And this is a serious discussion with some. I don't want to make light of it too much. There's someone coming around, probably wouldn't mind me saying that we've been interacting. She's been a part of the Unity School of Christianity. And by the way, it bothers me that anybody got a dually and a chain, let's just go yank that sign right out that uses the word Christianity on it because they're far from it. They teach reincarnation. They actually teach you can be Jesus. And so, it's really silliness. I won't be doing that under cover of darkness or anything, so don't worry. But I'd like to. But we do got to become like Jesus. That's the ultimate recalibration. If we want to reform, if we want to refound, the point we've got to get back to is Jesus. You got to. And look what he said here in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." He also said, "Go and make disciples." But here's the interesting thing. Who's building the church? Jesus. He said, "You guys go make disciples. I'll build the church." When we get that kind of backward, we kind of envision church. When we talk about building the church, what comes to mind? The building, the structure. We talk about going to church rather than being the church. And we're going to begin to change that language. We're going to create culture here where we understand we are to be the church, not go to church. You following with me? Now, again, I'm a both end guy. Come and see. But let's go and reach. Because most of our churches, what are we doing? We're competing for that 40% that will be attracted to a church building. 95% of churches are doing that. So you get this situation where rather than being Christ-centric, you can become church-centric. Very common. Or even pastor-centric, where the pastor is the anointed one that speaks, and you got to bring people to him, and he'll lead them to Christ, and that kind of thing. No, there's no clergy-laity divide. That just kills the teaching that we're all sent ones that Clint was sharing about. And so what we end up doing is we end up creating consumers of religious goods and services. Some of you probably saw this in Better Horses. I was kind of harping on this a little bit, saying, what are we doing at the holding pond? That's not what church is about. Is church more concerned with seating capacity or sending capacity? Are we more concerned with buildings to maintain or butts in the seats or bucks in the offering? If that's the case, we're missing what Jesus is saying. Get away from the holding pond. Get out there. Get downstream. The fishing's good. And he'll help us become fishers of men. And we've got to ask ourselves, if we're not fishing, are we really following? We've got to ask that question. And he said if we follow him, he will make us to become fishers of men. I found it interesting in putting this together yesterday, just reflecting on the fact that here in Matthew 14 or 4:19, where Jesus said, "I will make you to become fishers of men." This was early in his public ministry. He was just calling the disciples to follow him. Later, after 3 years with him, and before he ascends, he gives them the Great Commission. What does he say? Now you go and make. So he's modeling discipleship there. First of all, he says, "I will make you." Then he says, "You go and make." And it's interesting to me that in the Great Commission, he didn't say, "Be a disciple." And he didn't say, "Go be discipled." What did he say? Well, make them. Now, you can't make something that you're not. So I'm not against being a disciple. Yeah, we got to be them to make them. We got to be disciples that make disciples that make disciples. That's movement. That's where we need to get. And then the church looks like this. Then we've got our Jerusalem and our Judea and our Samaria and the uttermost parts of the earth being reached. Acts 1:8. That's what it says we'll do when we receive his power to be his witnesses. It was encouraging recently to put together kind of our family tree of what's come to be known as Great Commission Heartland, our region, which actually had its genesis in the church that Clint Hall planted. I'm so glad you're here, Clint. This is what it looks like. This is our family tree from Cornerstone at UMKC. There have been 20 churches genuinely planted, multiplied out from that one church, the first one. And this isn't hiring some church planter from some seminary. These are guys that were raised up, sent out, and over time. Now, we'd love it to be much more exponential, but I got to tell you, I get encouraged by that. And I think this informs our vision for the future. Jesus just wants to multiply this all over the place. Very encouraging. And so we have a net of about 17 churches. 2 of the campus churches became community churches, so they still exist, but those plants are in the 20. And then we've only had one that didn't survive after 5 years, and that's a pretty good run. So we've got a lot to praise Jesus about. One of the lessons that we learned, though, at Open Range, which now I really strongly say to ones that want to be a part of church planting, is don't front end your ecclesiology, your view, your theology of church up front. Don't go into an area taking your view of church with you. What we did at Open Range is we just found a soil that we thought in a 4-county area that we thought we would plant the gospel in. We didn't plant a church, we planted the gospel. And we saw a church grow out of that culture, that context, that people group. And so that's my advice to church planters these days. If you want to plant a church, just go plant the gospel. As a matter of fact, we put too many guys. The reason the church is stagnant, is not even keeping up with population in terms of conversion growth. Is very flat that way. Sure, people are getting saved. But if you're not keeping up with the population, there's something wrong. And one of the things that are wrong is we're putting leaders in position that haven't yet been disciple makers themselves. And so they're leading a group of people that are supposed to be disciple makers, and they're not making disciples. You know, their weeks are spent with all kinds of things. Now, this is part of disciple making, teaching. We teach to observe all that Christ commanded. That's part of the Great Commission. So don't get me wrong, that's part of it. But effectively seeing people come to Christ, being built up in the faith, to the point where they can then lead someone to Christ, that just doesn't happen nearly enough, does it? One of the interesting things to consider when we talk about ecclesiology, that just means our theology of church, and this front-loading our view of church on a particular culture, we are informed by Jesus. The incarnation is incredible doctrine. The creator of the universe that spoke all of this into existence came down into our hood and became our neighbor. That's pretty incredible, isn't it? Now, if anybody could have a laser light show fantastico, it's Jesus. But no, he came humbly, gently into the world as a babe, grew up, started his public ministry at 30, discipled guys, sent them out into the world after 3 years. Very incarnational. They were with him. That's how he discipled them. Of course, he had crowds he spoke to, too. And we can also be informed by the epistles. You know, it's interesting when you consider Peter in Antioch. He was there, the Galatian church. There was a point in Galatians 2. Here, I have the passage for us right here. It said, I had to, this is Paul speaking, I had to oppose him to his face, for what he did was very wrong. He was afraid of criticism, speaking of Peter. Even Barnabas was led astray by the hypocrisy when I saw that they were not following the truth of the gospel. Can the way we do church distort the gospel? You better believe it. Happened right here in Galatia. Our best methodologies need to flow out of our best theology. So and what better theology than going back to our Christology, Christ. It's interesting here that Peter, he'd already had his vision of the pigs in a blanket. And so he could be enjoying this salad right here. This low carb, gluten free salad. I love that. Anybody in? We're going to have some of that after church. We can be enjoying the bacon because what was happening and why Peter didn't hang out with the Gentiles is because some of the heavies from Jerusalem were saying, "Hey, wait a minute. We've got some ways we do church the Jewish way, and you guys aren't following suit." Paul gets in Peter's face and defends the Galatians and says, "You don't got to do that. You don't have to impose your Jewish ways on this church. Let the church develop out of the culture, something that's real for their context." And you better believe the men were thankful for that. If you think it's hard to get people baptized, try circumcision. This is how it needs to look. We start with Jesus. We get our theology right about Christ. We don't start with church. This is a church plant right here. We don't front load our view of church. We start with Jesus and incarnational kinds of approaches. Very missional too. He was on the go, reaching out. Out of Jesus, we get his commission to us, the mission. Go into all the world, the Great Commission. And then that determines and informs how we do church as we reach into context. Does that make sense? It's just so vital. This is the kind of thinking it's going to take, the kind of paradigm shifts it's going to take if we're going to make progress at an individual level, too. This should be us as an individual. We don't want to take our view of what a Christian looks like too far without being informed by what Christ modeled and taught. And through his mission to us, learn to incarnate with our culture. It's not just that the people of Christ have a mission in the world, more so that the Christ of mission has people in the world. It's not that the church has a mission, it's that the mission has a church. Is it starting to sink in? I know that's new thinking for many of us. I talk to pastors a lot, and this is like, huh? Okay. And they're buying it, but I mean, you got to think about this. It's a paradigm shift. Because we are sent. The Father had sent Jesus, and so he is sending us. That's our mission. The Great Commission. That's what God calls us to. And out of that calls the church into existence. So again, ultimately, it's about Jesus. It's becoming like Jesus. That's our ultimate recalibration. And that actually then informs discipleship, which is the next key area that we want to talk about. Remake disciples as Christ's commission. We need to revisit that. So one of the mistakes that I made as I'm researching movement freshly is that I think I had practically, not so much in my theology what I would verbalize, but in practice, I made the Great Commission central. And it was kind of an aha that I wasn't really living out. Jesus is central. Jesus is central, and then that makes disciple making our core task. You get the distinction? So it looks something like this. This is our discipleship that we want to see really strengthened here at Open Range. We've had a good, strong culture of evangelism and outreach, and that's part of the process. That's why I call this the single log staircase of discipleship. First of all, it's all about Jesus. It's about knowing Jesus, becoming like Jesus, sharing Jesus, and as we work our way from being far from God all the way to a leader, it's all about Jesus. One single log. So the evangelism happens in these stages here, those that are far from God and seeking. But we don't want to create this dichotomy, which is a tension in a lot of churches between evangelism and discipleship. We don't want that going on. It's one log, one staircase. That's the spiritual growth process. And so we've got folks at all different steps here. And I'm so thrilled. Open Ranges, this is our next level of development where we've got something going on to disciple all these stages and these steps. Very exciting. This was an interesting quote from a man I respect. His name is Dallas Willard, a famous author, Christian author and professor. This was his definition of a disciple. As Jesus' disciple, I'm learning from him how to lead my life in the kingdom of God as he would lead my life if he were I. Let me repeat that. As Jesus' disciple, I'm learning from him how to lead my life in the kingdom of God And that comes from making Jesus central too. It's not all about open range, is it? We've got to think beyond ourselves, even individually. God may ask us to do something sacrificially, not to our benefit, but for the greater good of the kingdom. So those are the kind of things that come into play. So we want Jesus to lead my life in the kingdom of God as he would lead my life if he were I. That's Dallas's way. And by the way, he's an old Missouri farm boy. That's why I like him. If we're going to have any kind of sustainable movement, it won't happen without disciple making. Now, you may say, I don't like that definition. Hey, that's really fine. I know all kinds of aspects of discipleship we could talk about, and we do at the Campfire Discipleship. If you want to join us on Friday nights or Sunday mornings, we unpack what a disciple is, and we look at it from all angles. And we've talked about other definitions. But the point is, we better have one. If we're going to be making them, we better know what they are, right? If you're in the widget business, you know what a widget is, and you know how to make one. If we're going to make disciples, if we're going to pour a concrete sidewalk, we've got to know how to make one. If we're going to make a disciple, we've got to know what one is. That's critical. And we're going to learn that as a church. We're going to start using language of discipleship more frequently here so that we know what we're making. We know what we're trying to accomplish. Does that make sense? And that's critical to any movement kind of thinking, especially as we want to re-movement the church. That's our next point here. What is movement? Why use that word? It kind of fell out of sorts for a long time, and I'm bringing it back. I'm talking about it all the time now. When you remember the Don't Do Drugs commercial that says, what's your brain look like on drugs? Well, this is what it looks like on religion. But this is what my brain looks like now on movement. It's kind of scrambled mess. I'm working on it. But I just wanted to share with you guys some of the things that I've been researching the past 7, 8 months, 9 months, about a year, really. Diving into what is a movement. Just starting over, getting the marker board out and erasing and say, Jesus, what is the church? What is a disciple? What does a network of churches look like? What is a movement? And going back to the refounding to find the answers. It's been so refreshing. And that's why Jesus is in the middle. I probably would have started a year ago putting the Great Commission right there, because a lot of things flow out of the Great Commission. And I get that in essence, that's part of who Jesus is. I know language like gospel-centered. I get that. Jesus is the Word. But in terms of making some distinction to understand movement, it's been very helpful to me to say, all right, no, it's first of us start with Jesus movement. It's all about Jesus. And out of that, then, we can think in more kingdom-minded ways, like the Sending Project does. Think more in city reaching, which is over here, the one church movement, where you begin to think in terms of reaching your Jerusalem more effectively. And it's going to be partnering with other churches. We aren't going to get it done ourselves, are we? It's going to take a citywide approach that we begin to view ourselves as one church. Very important. Very important. And then, of course, disciple making is the core task. So we got disciple making movement, got it right there at the forefront, right on top. And there's a whole lot that we could talk about there. Missional movement, that's a word that's being used. It has been the past few years. Missional, what's that mean? Well, the whole discussion about missional is just what Clint was sharing. The word missio means sent. We're sent ones. We all should be on mission. We're all missionaries, and I'll come back to that point in just a minute. It's the whole incarnational discussion. Such a wonderful doctrine. When we get back to looking at Jesus, he's got so much we can learn about being incarnational and attractional. Both and. And then apostolic movement. This is probably the most controversial, but some of you have been hearing me say, hey, for too long we've been trying to do church with just a pastor or a teacher. And so it looks like we're trying to get a handle on church like this. And some of our theology even is the pastor teacher is the same person. No, it's going to take all 5 of Ephesians 4. That's what's referred to here. The equippers, the apostles, the prophets, evangelists. And I'm not talking about the train wreck, hyper charismatic Pentecostal version that really distorts the conversation. No, I'm talking about going back to our refounding, looking at Ephesians 4. What does it mean? How could we release the apes, the apostles and prophets, evangelists, get them in the game and get them equipping us? The evangelist, he doesn't just reach out. His primary task, according to Ephesians 4, is to equip others to evangelize. Teachers. Are you a teacher? Are you gifted that way? Your job is just not to teach, it's to equip others to teach. That's how we're going to replicate. That's how we're going to fulfill the Great Commission. And then lastly, people movement. This is incredibly important. And I want to bring it home then to us. Us as missionaries. We need to see ourselves that way. You know, as we were discussing at Campfire Discipleship last night, one of the ones mentioned, I grew up being taught that a missionary is the person with their picture on the wall, and we might pray for them occasionally, send them money. If we had a missionary wall, you'd all have your picture up there. Let's do it. Let's just have a missionary wall right there. Everybody bring their best portrait, and we'll send all you money. No, we won't do that. But the point is, our leadership views really impacts this one. If we believe in any kind of clergy-laity distinction, that kills movement. Because then the people don't see themselves as the ministers. The equippers need to equip the saints. We're all the saints to do the work of ministry. We do the ministry. And the equippers equip us to do it. That's that whole piece there. So you don't want any clergy-laity kind of nonsense going on. And then we've got to really come to terms with the fact that we are missionaries. Now, that might sound strange. One of the gals at the Campfire Discipleship last night said this was an encouraging thing. They had their biker vest on, and they were in a restaurant, and some little girl said, "Oh, I think they're a missionary," because it had Christ on their vest. And I said, "Well, the next time you see her, say, well, you're one too." We've got to get to be thinking like this. We are full-time missionaries, each and every one of us. So then this is what movement begins to look like. If we're making disciples that are making disciples, that's people as missionaries reaching out on mission, sent ones into every sphere of society. By the way, Kansas City has a pretty healthy faith at work movement going on. And that's going to be part of the equation too. Because we spend so much time in the marketplace. We've got to learn to be effective there. So much of our time is spent there. That's part of movement thinking. That's this piece. People on mission in every sphere. Then, if you plant the gospel and allow new churches to grow up out of that, this begins to take shape. And here's the end result. Movement. Every sphere of society is being saturated. Isn't that exciting to think about? That's the vision of the Sending Project. That's what we want to see accomplished. I was so encouraged to read Colossians 1 again just today, and I decided to share it here. I'll share this with you. I'll just read it myself. God has given me the responsibility of serving His church by proclaiming His entire message to you. This message was kept secret for centuries and generations past, but now it has been revealed to God's people. This is kind of the unlearning and refounding that takes place. For God wanted them to know that the riches of the glory of Christ are for you Gentiles too. And this is the secret. Are you listening? Got a secret here. Christ in you. Simply that. Christ lives in you. That's the secret. This gives you assurance of glory, sharing His glory. So we tell others about Christ, warning everyone, teaching everyone with all the wisdom that God has given us. We want to present them to God perfect in their relationship to Christ. That's why I work and struggle, Paul says, so hard, depending on Christ's mighty power that works within me. So this is what it looks like. The secret is out. No longer a secret. Christ in you. So, hey, back to the apostle, prophet, evangelist thing. If that throws you off, don't worry about it. Because you know why? Christ in you. Who's the best apostle of all time? Jesus. Who's the most effective prophet that ever lived? Jesus. Who is the greatest evangelist of all time? Jesus. Anybody else even compare? Who is the greatest shepherd? The chief shepherd, he's called. Jesus. How about teacher? Nobody taught like Jesus. Filled and driven by the Holy Spirit and the Father, speaking what Jesus wanted spoken. He taught like no others. That's in you. Let that sink in. Christ in you. So within you is the potential for tremendous power. There's seeds of potential in you because Christ is in you. All that's in you. Have you ever heard the saying, an apple is an orchard? What does that mean? It just means that there's seeds that have the potential. The seed hidden in the heart of the apple is the orchard invisible. All this is in here. All that Christ wants to accomplish out there is in you. I had fun with the Campfire Discipleship group last night telling them, if ISIS came in and killed everybody but one of you, one of them spoke up that they wouldn't get that far. I know in this group that's they're telling the truth. Some of you probably packing. Now, so shouldn't do that in a school district, by the way. But anyway, but let's say ISIS came in. They were killing people. Some of you let's say one of you survived and killed the ISIS guys. And Jesus said, okay, I want to start movement with you. He could get the job done with just you. Don't get hung up on the whole ISIS thing. I'm just making a point that if you were the only Christian left on the planet, Jesus could get his job done with you. Amen? That's movement thinking. That's what we've got to refound. Get back to the original flashpoint. That's a flashpoint that brings energy to us. And then we can fan that into flame and make a firestorm. So just in summary, remaster the centrality of Jesus. Remake disciples. Remake the commission of Jesus. Removement the church of Jesus. And lastly, remissionary the calling of Jesus. And then you're going to be just like that match right there, falling onto some matches that's just going to create a firestorm. Oh, I just love 2 Timothy. It says, that is why I would remind you to stir up, rekindle the embers of, fan into flame, keep burning the gift of God, the inner fire that is in you. So every one of us is a spark. Does every spark turn into a firestorm? The potential's there. Every one of us has Christ in us, if we've come to personally know Christ, of course. The spark can turn into a flame can grow into a fire, and a fire can become a firestorm. A match is safest in the box, but that's not what matches are made for. Your horse is safest in the corral, but that's not what your horse was made for. Your Harley in the garage, that's the safest place for it, but that's not what your Harley was made for. Ship is safest in the harbor, but that's not what ships are made for. Let's strike the original match and just see what can happen.